I listen to a true crime podcast about myself. Every night on my walk home from work, I listen to true crime podcasts. Even though my favorite podcast already released their episode for this week, the app said there was a new one. Excited, I hit play. It was a small town, the kind that still has mom and pop shops lining the street, the kind where everyone knows your name. But little did the residents know that they would soon be rocked by a horrible crime. I stopped at a traffic light. The red glowed in the darkness, glinting off the wet street. A black SUV sloshed by. Across from me, eerie blue refrigerator lights glowed from inside a corner deli. The chairs all up on their tables, feet in the air. The signal turned to walk. That chilly September evening was no different for the young student. She'd left her shift at the local store and walked back home, except she never made it home. Young student. Local store. Damn, this was hitting close to home. I was a part-time student at Franklin Community College and worked at the local convenience store. And of course, I was walking home. I glanced behind me, looking at the alleyway behind Alessandro's Pizza, which was dark except for the neon light spilling from the sign. Her boyfriend reported her missing the next day. The town conducted a volunteer-led search, and after 2 days, they found something. Dread formed in my stomach, anticipating a body. But what he said next was so much worse. Washed up on the shore of Worthington Lake, they found a pair of size 9 red Converse sneakers. I stopped and looked down at my red Converse sneakers, damp from the rain. What the hell? My heart began to pound. The shoes were sent to a forensic analyst who would compare its wear pattern to another pair of her shoes to try and determine if they belonged to the victim. A rumbling sound made me jump. I turned to see a dark SUV turning left at the intersection. Didn't I see that car a few minutes ago? Maybe it's following me. And the car passed me and disappeared into the darkness. Come on, Sarah, get a grip. Converse are popular sneakers. A little out of fashion, but still. 9 is a common women's shoe size. And what college student doesn't have some sort of a job? What, you think you're listening to some sort of prophecy of your own death? Yeah, right. After a few weeks, the results came back. The analyst was certain. The shoes belonged to none other than Sarah Campbell. The blood drained from my face. Sarah Campbell. My name. What the fuck? How? I didn't have time to think. I forced myself to move. I broke into a run. The small shops turned into a colorful blur. Searching the lake came up empty. Without a body, a crime is hard to solve. But police didn't give up. And finally, a witness came forward. Someone had seen a car parked at the lake that night around 2 a.m. A black SUV with darkened windows. No. What the hell is going on? I whipped around. The street was empty. No people, no cars, no witnesses, said the little voice in the back of my mind, the one that's watched way too many true crime shows. My eyes scanned the shops, all closed. There were 6 black SUVs matching the witness's description in the Franklin area, but one of them, in particular, caught Detective Nolan's eye. It belonged to John Kelly, a registered sex offender. Vroom. The sound was so soft I almost didn't hear it over the voice of the podcast. I whipped around, and there it was, 2 blaring white headlights behind me, coming from a black SUV. I forced my legs to pump faster. The car didn't speed up. It crawled along, slowly, taking its time, like the driver knew he could catch me, no matter what. I glanced back, trying to make him out behind the darkened windshield, but the headlights were too bright to see anything. Kelly wasn't just a registered sex offender. He'd been convicted of assaulting a woman he worked with, who had multiple piercings and short, dark hair, just like Sarah. The car crawled down the road, stalking me, like a lioness stalks her prey. I veered left, onto our dark residential street. Just a few more steps. Headlights flashed across me, illuminating my running shadow on the pavement. I didn't look back. I just ran, as fast as I possibly could. The little brown house with the yellow shutters came into view. I sprinted across the grass, grabbing my keys from my pocket. Click. I threw the door open and slammed it shut behind me. Then I turned the deadbolt, collapsed against the door, and began crying. I heard the rush of the car passing our house, continuing down the road. But I wasn't safe. Gabe wasn't home yet. I was alone, in a dark house, with someone driving down the street who knew exactly where I lived. Still sobbing, I checked all the locks. Then I called Gabe, who assured me he was 5 minutes away. I made my way down the dark hallway and headed into the bathroom. Then I set my phone on the counter, grabbed a clump of tissues, and began to blow my nose. Click. I jumped, whipped around, but it wasn't coming from outside the door. My phone's screen lit up. The podcast was still playing. I must have hit it when I put the phone down. It had skipped several minutes forward according to the play indicator. "What do you think happened to Sarah?" the baritone voice asked. I reached for it to turn it off. Well, she'd told me she wanted to run away before. I stopped dead. It was Gabe's voice, clear as day, coming from the speakers. She did. "Why?" the voice asked. She wasn't happy with her grades, her job, her parents. She told me sometimes she'd dream of just moving to some random state and leaving it all behind. I froze, staring at the mirror. I never said that. Never. Gabe was lying? I mean, that was hurtful to me as her boyfriend, you know? I thought we were going to get married someday, but apparently she didn't feel the same way. My heart pounded in my ears. "So, you think she just skipped town and is happily living her life out somewhere else, rather than being abducted or murdered?" A pause. "Yes, that's exactly what I think. That's all for now. Thank you to our listeners." The outro played. I stared at my reflection, everything coming down all at once, my mind trying to race and catch up with what it meant. The front door creaked open. Footsteps sounded outside. "Sarah, I'm back." I backed away from the door. "Sarah?" My eyes fell on the window. I ran over to it, turned the lock. "Push." I popped the screen out. Then I swung a leg over, pulled myself through the window, and ran as fast as I could. Story 2. I was recently released from jail for a crime I did not commit. I was recently released from jail for a crime I did not commit. I'm not a Redditor, but a friend suggested I post here to get my message out. I'm not sure if this is the best subreddit to post this on, but I don't really know where it fits. Let's call me Sylvie Blank. I spent the last 15 years in jail. I could probably write a number of r/no sleep posts about my time being incarcerated, but I'm not here to talk too much about that. I'm here to talk about the crime that I was wrongly accused of back in 1999. I was 26 years old and a single mother of my twin babies. We can call Charlie and Victoria. They both had red curls and a smile brighter than the sun. I worked as a receptionist full-time, and my babies would go to the preschool the town over from mine. The three of us lived in an old apartment complex built in the 1950s. The father of my children was out of the picture once I told him I was pregnant. Life happens. One afternoon after work, I pulled up to the daycare a bit later than usual to pick up my babies. There was some pretty heavy traffic that day. Outside were 2 daycare teachers, one scrounging around the bushes, and one on the phone. I parked my car and walked up to them. "Lose a kid? Maybe 2?" I said sarcastically. But when the ladies looked at each other without saying anything, I wished I could take the words back. Who? It kills me to think of the moment they opened their mouths. "It just happened a few minutes ago. We were about to call you." The one woman by the bushes said hesitantly. "Both?" I yelled. "Aye, we were just getting our bags ready for dismissal." I turned around and the back door was open, and Victoria and Charlie were gone. The woman continued. 1,000 fucked up scenarios raced through my mind at once. The one teacher was on the phone with the owner of the daycare. I grabbed the phone from her, hung up, and called the police. Then a blur. A month passed. No leads, no babies. Those weeks were fuzzy and dark. I didn't really see around me. Everything was dark. I only had eyes for my babies. I cried and sat and smelled my babies' clothes and beds. 2 months passed. I just put coffee on when a knock came to my door. I froze for a minute and then opened the door. At my doorstep were Charlie and Victoria's tiny shoes. My first thought was that it was getting cold and my poor baby's feet must be cold, but then reality set in. I lost it. I ran to get my phone and call the police. They came immediately, but moments later, something was not right. I sensed that feeling when you know people are whispering about you. "Officers, what's going on?" I said to the men. "Sylvie, these shoes are Charlie and Victoria's, correct?" one officer said. "Yes, the shoes they went missing in," I replied. "There's a bit of a hole here, Sylvie. See, these aren't the shoes you originally described your children wearing on the day they went missing." The same officer said. I furrowed my brow and tried to recall. Then I realized they were right. Those shoes left at the door were their everyday shoes. The shoes they were wearing the day they went missing were their dress shoes. We were supposed to go to my mother's house for dinner that night.
"Oh yeah, they were wearing their dress shoes," I said to clarify. Then I realized the hole. "Why were their everyday shoes sitting outside of my apartment?" I asked the officers. They said that they were wondering the same thing. They stared at me a moment too long, and then they asked, "What were you doing the afternoon that Victoria and Charlie went missing again, Miss Blank?" "I think I should call my lawyer," I said sternly. The next months were another disgusting blur. First, the shoe mix-up. Turns out, those shoes had a drop of blood on them, presumably Victoria's. Victoria used to get nosebleeds. I said so many times, but nobody believed it was that. I started to not believe it was that either. Then, there was my alibi. My alibi sucked. I was driving on a highway with no cameras. My alibi was strong up until I left work. Nobody could account for my whereabouts for the 30 minutes I was sitting in traffic. Next, the father of my children. He now lives in England, so there was no way it was him. He has a rock-solid alibi. And lastly, my stupid line. The line that plays in my head over and over again every single day. Lose a kid? Maybe two. On September 4th, 1999, I was sentenced to 35 years to life in prison for the murders of my babies. At that moment, everything inside of me died. All I lived for from then on was the distant memories of my babies and the quickly disappearing hope that somehow everything would work out. In prison, I bulked up. I hardened. I forgot what hope was. I tried drugs. I had fucked around with women. I was tattooed with my babies' names across my chest. I read books, wrote, and played board games. I lost any sort of belief in God or justice or faith. I was punched in the face 13 times and in the breasts 5 times. I tried to appeal countless times. I tried committing suicide once. I did not kill my babies. On September 1st, 2014, the Court of Appeal overturned my conviction. My mother worked relentlessly on this until she won. I cannot thank her enough to this day. A young man who worked maintenance in my apartment building stole my babies. He was 23 years old. One Christmas, I even gave him cookies and a $10 bill. He took my babies during recess at the daycare. He swooped in and out quickly and discreetly. The teachers knew my babies were missing about a half hour after recess, and a full hour and a half before I had arrived to pick them up. The young man first kept my babies in the basement where he kept his maintenance supplies. He kept them alive for a bit. He entered my apartment one day while I was at work. He took my baby's shoes. A few days later, he set them outside of my door and then quickly hid in a supply closet right near my front door. The whole thing was happening right under my nose. Victoria and Charlie's remains were found on the side of a highway in a trash bag in upstate New York. The autopsy suggests that they both died of head injuries. They were cremated and spread along a beach, their favorite place to be. To write this piece in an afternoon and to walk away from my computer does not even begin to scratch the surface of the bigger picture. I live with the constant thoughts of how terrifying the last moments of Charlie and Victoria's life must have been. Mommy wasn't there for them. God wasn't there for them. One thing I can take away from this experience is that we are random clusters of cells with feelings and guts, and that's about it. It's all a game, and most of us are playing it wrong. We walk around on this planet thinking we know what is going on. In reality, however, there is no true reality. Our reality is what we make of what is around us, what our squishy and useless brains can perceive. We do not know the dark, devilish corners of this earth that we do not feel or see. We do not know how evil and primitive humans can be. We are animals. We are impulsive. Some are kind and fragile, but in the end, we are all useless and pointless. Our squishy and pointless brains lead us to believe we are something more so that we can reproduce. And for what? To start the whole game over again and again. Story 3. I own a journal written by a serial killer. When I checked it this morning, I found a new entry. My first true crime novel was published in early 2011. The book followed the 4-year career of a serial killer in southern Illinois, covering the grisly details of his murders and eventually ending with his arrest. The book was absolutely perfect. I poured hundreds of hours into research, interviews, and writing. I was convinced that it was a sure ticket into a life as a famous author. My publisher had other plans. They claimed that money was far too tight and that they had to cancel my marketing campaign. It was just a coincidence that they abandoned me just as they pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars resources towards another author. So of course, my novel failed. Of course, no one bought it. And if there's one thing publishers avoid more than unpublished amateurs, it's authors with a single failed book. I've spent the last few years trying to cobble something together that might convince them to give me another chance. When I heard about a string of murders in my town, slow my research into the killer's background, his victims, his method of murder, all of it. I took a sip as I reread another police report. The killer had used a fire axe to commit the crimes. Very gory, that was good. Gory murders always sell better than boring firearm-related crimes.
He unlocked the door for me and showed me a few of the rooms. The apartment had been almost completely cleared out by someone. I guessed first the police and then movers. I nodded along as the landlord continued the tour of the apartment, showing me the kitchen, then the master bedroom. I knew the killer had a habit of hiding bodies inside crawl spaces from my research and was on the lookout for them. I noticed a vent in the corner of the master bedroom that looked to be pressure fit into the wall. "Seems like a great place, just the kind of thing I've been looking for," I said, wiping away the post-drinking sweats that were growing on my forehead. "You mind if I use the bathroom before we finish here?" The landlord pointed to the master bathroom. "Be my guest." I purposefully spent a long time in there, hoping he'd leave the bedroom. I was rewarded when he called out, "I'll be by my car downstairs when you're finished." I left the bathroom and crept up to the vent. I pulled hard on the metal and was rewarded as it slid smoothly from the wall. Inside was a space about 2 feet wide and 1 foot tall. It extended back into the darkness for several feet at least. And there, lying in the dust on the metal floor, was a leather-bound notebook. I snatched it from the ground, hardly believing my luck. It was thick and well-used, but I stuffed it inside my shirt for the time being. Replacing the metal grate was harder than pulling it off, but I managed it without making too much noise. I returned to the landlord outside, turning to look up at the small apartment. "I'm going to be honest with you," I said. "How's that?" he asked, confused. "I'm Jim Sullivan, a true crime novelist," I said. "I'm here to find out if there's anything interesting left about your most recently departed tenant." The landlord's face clouded over with anger. "So this was a waste of my time, then? I was wondering if you had any information about— Not for liars. Get off my property. I never want to see you here again." I thanked him and returned to my car, my mind already on nothing but the thick leather booklet inside my shirt. I rushed home, guarding the notebook like a goose with a golden egg. I prepared my desk with a spiral notebook and a blue pen ready by my right hand. Then, trembling, I opened the notebook. It was far better and far worse than I could have ever imagined. The killer had written his planning of the murders in excruciating detail. He explained how he watched the houses, how he waited to see whether or not the husbands loved their wives, whether or not the children were disobedient, what kind of dinners they ate and at what time. He must have stalked them for days beforehand. But the details in the planning were nothing to the details in describing the murders themselves. I had to pause halfway through reading one account. He kept describing the look on the father's face as his wife died. I poured myself a tall drink, drained it, then poured myself another. The killer languished in the description of their cries, their last dying moments, their pitiful supplication for mercy. I finished the bottle before I finished the notebook. After his account of the fourth family murder, the pages of the book finally, mercifully, went blank. When he finished describing the desecration of the last corpse, I closed the book with trembling fingers. My head throbbed with alcohol and the horrible images racing through my mind, but I couldn't help but hold my hands to my mouth in joy. What a find! What a treasure trove of information! 100 years of interviews couldn't give me what this one book had just dropped into my lap. I was going to be famous again. I laughed out loud to the empty room, picked up the already empty bottle of whiskey to my lips, and licked at the last drops before walking to my bedroom. I woke up late the next afternoon, feeling woozy. I felt something worse than a hangover. Must have drunk more than I'd been planning to. But could anyone really blame me, reading those horrible things I'd read? No, of course, no one could blame me. In fact, no one could blame me if I had another drink right now to ease this horrible throbbing in my skull. I got to my feet and walked to the kitchen. I cracked open a beer before walking back to my desk. The notebook caught my eyes as I passed. It was different somehow. Thicker. I picked it up and realized that my blue pen had been lodged inside of the leather-bound notebook. I opened it up and saw a brand new entry that hadn't been there the night before. I sat down at the desk, trying to make sense of this new entry, written in a different handwriting from the others. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was reading. I read, in similar, meticulous detail, how I had gone to a house up in the mountains and killed a young couple on their honeymoon. I read about how I'd killed the husband, and that I'd taken the wife's body back with me. I immediately jumped to my feet and ran to my computer, Googling the address furiously. Had I written this in some kind of murder and alcohol-induced sleepwalking? The address was real. It was a house just a half hour away, and there were no news articles about any murders in the area. My breathing continued to quicken as I stared at the house. The descriptions from the notebook matched it perfectly. It wasn't necessarily my handwriting, but there's no doubt it was different from the other entries, and it had been written with my pen. I Googled the nearest payphone, marked the location, and drove there. I dialed 911 with a gloved hand. 911, what's your emergency? A voice on the other end asked. Can you send someone over to a house for me? I'm concerned that something bad may have happened. Sir, what do you... I cut her off, instead passing the address. Did you get that? I asked. She said. I read the address again, then hung up. I drove back to my house, thinking hard the entire way. God, I needed a drink. My garage door opened up and I drove inside. It was only then that I noticed the axe on the ground. I closed the garage door and rounded my car. An unfamiliar axe lay on the ground beside the door to my house. I knelt down and picked it up to inspect it. The metal head was crusted with a layer of blood and hair. I stumbled back, holding my hand to my mouth. When no monster leapt from the darkness, I dropped the axe to the floor and walked inside to open another bottle. I spent the next hour constantly refreshing the news and praying for what must have been the first time in years. Please, I begged. Please let this be some big misunderstanding. Please. It only took 3 hours before the double homicide was front-page news. I was already in an alcohol-fueled haze at that point. Every single detail was correct. Husband dead, wife missing. I realized then that I hadn't looked around my house. The wife's body was somewhere, after all. Wouldn't she be in the house of her killer? The notebook had been silent on her final location. I spent the next hour looking through my house for places where I may have stashed her body, but came up short. A strange, bizarre revulsion to the notebook came over me. It had caused this. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that if I'd never picked it up, I wouldn't have that axe in my garage nor a conscience so weighted down by... No, that wasn't possible. I had to get rid of it. I briefly considered burning the notebook, but rejected the idea. No, something told me that the book belonged back in the apartment where I found it. I drank a shot of espresso to sober up, then started walking. The apartment was just a few blocks away, and I figured I'd already killed enough people for one day. The night was cold, but I barely felt the chill through the haze of guilt, confusion, and fear. I reached the killer's apartment 20 minutes later. One of the windows on the ground floor was unlocked, which allowed me to slide inside. I closed it behind me and looked around at the apartment. The other killer had turned himself in, hadn't he? He'd had a conscience. My mouth turned down into a snarl. It wasn't my fault, even if I did do it. It was this damned notebook. I pulled it out and threw it onto the ground. After a moment of hesitation, I scooped it back up and walked up the dark stairs to the master bedroom. It was the same as I'd left it the day before, though the vent looked off. Maybe the landlord had noticed I'd messed with it. No matter. I knelt down and pulled hard on the vent, earning a cut on my thumb as the metal slid free. I reached down and grabbed the notebook, then extended my arm into the darkness where I hit something soft and wet. I flipped on my phone's light and saw the body of a woman lying inside, covered in enough blood to leave the scent of iron in the air. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. Surely I hadn't killed this woman then driven to this house, right? Then my thought from earlier returned to me. The woman's body was almost certainly on the killer's property. The front door of the apartment below me opened with a crash. I spun and backed up, still on my hands and knees, as the sound of slow, steady footsteps climbed up the stairs. The bedroom door opened, and the light flicked on. The landlord I'd met the other day stood in the doorway holding an axe covered in still wet blood. "Well, I'm sad to say you weren't at home this time," he said, gripping the head of the axe with a beefy fist. "You're probably wondering what the hell's going on, am I right?" He pointed the handle of the axe towards me. Am I right? I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He hefted the axe in his hands. There's just something about convincing other people that they're killers. Not even the light leaving someone's eyes gives me the rush I felt when that poor sap turned himself in. Sorry, liar. You just happened to be the next to pick up the book. But you made it easy. You even gave me your name. Looks like I'll have to leave that notebook out for someone else to find. Maybe a detective will wake up to find he's killed his wife. What do you think? He took a step into the room. I jumped to my feet and ran for the bathroom. I knew from my time there earlier that it had a window. I'd only made it a few feet before the axe slammed into the back of my left arm. I ignored the pain and leapt at the window, crossed my arms into an X, and crashed through the glass. The fall was just long enough for me to reflect on my poor decisions before I hit the ground. A dozen things inside me broke with the impact, but that wasn't what worried me. What worried me was that I'd hear heavy footsteps again. But I didn't hear footsteps. I heard a cry of surprise. A young couple ran over to me. "Are you okay?" the man shouted. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the wife calling the police. I'll skip over my stay in the hospital, the police's fruitless search for the landlord, and my panic attacks. They still haven't found him, and I don't think I'll be able to sleep until they do. I let the police take copies of the notebook, but I still own the original. And, I'm not going to lie to you, I still occasionally check the ending to make sure no new entries have shown up.
Story 4. The silent witness, Detective James Carter, had seen his fair share of crime scenes. But this one was different. A wealthy businessman, Robert Langley, was found dead in his study, the room meticulously arranged as if death had been expected. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, only a single playing card resting on his chest. The Ace of Spades. The card had been left at 3 other crime scenes over the past month, each victim connected in subtle ways. Business partners, old friends, distant relatives. Someone was orchestrating a deadly game, but James had no idea who. The only clue was the silent witness, a security camera in Langley's study. The footage was corrupted, but a technician recovered fragments. It showed Langley sitting at his desk when the lights flickered. A shadow moved behind him, then static. Digging into Langley's past, James uncovered an old scandal, one involving blackmail, fraud, and a man named Victor Crane, who had vanished 5 years ago. When James located Victor's old residence, he found a room covered in newspaper clippings, all about the recent murders. On the desk, another Ace of Spades awaited him. Then his phone rang. A voice, distorted and cold, whispered, "You're getting too close. Time to play your hand." James rushed back to his apartment, gun drawn. The door was ajar. Inside, on his coffee table, was another card, the Ace of Spades. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. Determined, James spent the next few days combing through old records, trying to link the victims more definitively. He met with Langley's estranged wife, who revealed something chilling. Langley and the other victims were all part of an exclusive secret society called the Black Chamber. Its purpose was shrouded in mystery, but whispers suggested it had dabbled in dangerous affairs, power plays, assassinations, and even occult practices. A former member, who had gone into hiding, reluctantly agreed to meet James. The Black Chamber, he murmured, was not just a club. It was a pact, a blood pact. They made a deal, and now someone is collecting. James pressed for more, but the man cut the conversation short, clearly terrified. That night, James received an anonymous package at his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address and a time, midnight. Come alone. Against his better judgment, James followed the instructions. The address led him to an abandoned theater on the outskirts of the city. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit stage. There, under a single spotlight, stood a hooded figure. "Detective Carter," the figure intoned, "you have stepped into a game that you cannot win." James aimed his gun. "I don't play games. Who are you?" The figure chuckled and removed the hood. It was Victor Crane, but he looked different, older but eerily unchanged from the photos James had seen from years ago. The Black Chamber thought they could cheat fate. They were wrong, and now their debt must be paid. James took a step forward, but a sudden sharp pain shot through his body. He looked down to see a small dart embedded in his neck. His vision blurred, his limbs grew heavy, and he collapsed. When he awoke, he was lying on the stage, a single Ace of Spades resting on his chest. The game wasn't just about the past anymore. Now James was a player. If you love dark crime mysteries, subscribe to Dark Whispers now and uncover the truth behind the shadows.